Welcome to Church for Skeptics. Dan Arsenal here. There have been several, let me turn my notes on over, attempts through the years to prove the existence of God one way or the other. Some say you can't prove the existence of God or the non-existence of God. Maybe. But my point is this, there are several, probably a dozen good arguments for the existence of God. John Calvin would have said that the final deal breaker with our existence as God is in our own hearts, the sort what he called the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine. I would agree with that, and yet I think God has given us, here's the big point that I want to make through several videos. God has given us an abundance of evidence that could really not come from nowhere else for his own existence and a lot of other things about him, but beyond his existence. Bertrand Russell was a philosopher and a mathematician, really smart guy, British. He was born in 1872, died in 1970, so that's 92 years, 98 years. So he lived to be a long time. Of course, he was an atheist, and he went around and gave talks about why I'm not a Christian. He wrote an essay called Why I'm Not a Christian. And he argued, most atheists have to do this, they don't really argue positively for the existence of God. They generally argue against what we would call the arguments for the existence of God. And that's exactly what he did. Somebody asked him, I don't know when, maybe towards the end of his life, Russell, what if you die and you stand before God and God says, why didn't you believe in me? And Russell said, I would ask him this, why didn't you give me enough evidence? There's not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. That's my whole point here, is I think the evidence is overwhelming. And let me add to this, I think in the last 100 years, maybe in response to the current culture, most people believed in God for many, many years, and most people still do. But the idea of materialism and atheism and the non-existence of God, of course, is growing. And I think it's kind of through the idea that science tells us all we know and all we can know, and since science can really only deal with the physical, then the physical must be all that exists, and on and on and on. And I think mostly it's just our culture is walking more and more away from God. It's like the Russian who went through the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. He analyzed it and how horrible it was, and he said, we've just walked away from God as a nation. I think that's what's happening, and my little small contribution, I hope, is to push that reset button a little bit. But here's my point again. I didn't really finish it. God has given us, in response, I think, to the direction away from him. I think he has given in more and more. I think there's always been overwhelming evidence for God, and the Bible certainly would concur. But I think God has given us overwhelming evidence more and more in the last 100 years, starting with the idea that the universe had a beginning. We call it the Big Bang, which is exactly what Scripture says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Listen, the only reason that scientists and people in general pushed back against the Big Bang theory, Einstein pushed against it, so many pushed against it, Steven Weinberg didn't like it. And the reason they didn't like it is it was sounded too much like Genesis. And they said that very thing. And that was across the board. The only reason they would push back against the beginning for the universe is that's what the Bible teaches. Of course, the evidence just became overwhelming. Well, not only that, I think in the last 50 years, that's 100 years ago, virtually, 1920s. But in the last 50 years, or a little bit more, there has been an increasing overwhelming evidence for the idea that the universe is designed, and that the earth is designed within that universe, and that we are designed within the earth, within the universe. I think it's overwhelming, and I just feel like God's mercy is giving us more and more evidence to believe. I hope you're just at least willing to listen to this, because what I think is in the next couple of videos here is this, that most people maybe you don't know what the evidence is. At least be willing to be open-minded about the evidence. If you decide, nope, not enough evidence, like Bertrand Russell, okay. It's interesting to me that Russell took issue with the three big arguments for the existence of God, and those would be, number one, the cosmological argument, the cause, the idea from causation. You know what his argument against that was? Well, who made God? If God caused everything, who made God? Now, that's a summary of what he did, but if you read what he wrote, which I did, that's the whole argument. Who caused God? Well, the whole idea is that puts God in the same category as the universe itself. It's a cause and effect relationship. There has to be an eternal first cause, and I think I can argue, and not hostilely, I think I can argue logically that you have to believe in an eternal first cause that is itself uncaused, and so there is no beginning and ending for whatever caused the universe. It has to be eternal. It has to be timeless and immaterial. I won't go there that far today, but I just think that Russell's argument against the cosmological argument doesn't hold up. His argument against the teleological argument, the argument from design, that's what we're majoring on here. And his argument against that was that, and this is interesting because it's in sort of the early days of quantum physics, but he said that quantum physics proved, now get this, that the reality is more about probability than it is about laws. Let me try to explain what he's saying here. We think of natural laws, the law of gravity, etc., as a law, but really it's just probable. It's just what always happens. And so he said quantum physics, and in those days, and maybe they still think this way, that quantum particles just popped into existence for no reason, just by random chance. Of course, I don't believe that. I don't think you really believe that either. I don't think anybody really believes that. Nothing comes from nothing. But his idea is, since the reality is just about probability. Well, that's kind of like what we want to show, that in the last 50 years, that's just been devastated. There's no chance for chance to be the reason for much of anything that has come into existence. And so that's what we want to major on. I'll finish this because of what Bertrand Russell said. His argument against, this is so strange to me, his argument against the moral argument for God. In other words, if morality, objective morality exists, then there has to be a God. There has to be a purpose behind it. There has to be a reason for our existence. There has to be a standard of right and wrong beyond us, a transcendent objective morality. His argument against that was called the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma was something that Plato made up, in the words of Socrates, who said to Euthyphro, the Greek friend that he had there, did the gods make the laws because they were good, or are the laws good because God made them? In other words, is God arbitrarily saying what's good, or is God subject to a higher power, a higher standard of good that he has to follow himself? Well, that's not really a dilemma anyway, and of course the answer to that has been proven over and over and over again. Of course, the answer really is both. God does what he does because it is good, but why is it good? That's the question. And the reason that it's good is because of his own nature being good, being perfect. And by definition, the God of the universe has to be morally perfect. Otherwise, there would be something wrong with him. I'm not trying to major on this today, but I just think Russell's argument saying there's no evidence for God, and his arguments against the arguments for God, are just not very good. What we're trying to do today and in the following videos is to show that science is a gift from God. The whole idea of science means knowledge. God's given us knowledge. He's given us the ability to reason and make decisions, unlike atheism and unlike materialism. If you follow their logic, then we're all dancing to our DNA. There are no real decisions being made. The whole idea of science is that we can make progress. We can understand things. We can look at the evidence and draw conclusions for that. And in the last 50 years, the conclusions that have been drawn is that it is unbelievably on the favor of, so much so that even artificial intelligence will tell you that the most obvious answer is that God has designed the universe. So much for artificial intelligence. Let's focus on the teleological argument, the argument from design. Here it is. If anything functions, if it's working, let's say. Now let's give Darwinism its due here. Darwinism would say that, and of course Richard Dawkins would be the leader of that today, that things that function just happen to function, and the reason they look designed for a purpose is that they are in fact fulfilling a role, fulfilling a job, but they happened unto that position of fulfilling a role by accident. It was just chance, mistake until they got it right. Well, if you can believe that, I think that's real blind faith, and we're going to show that in the next couple of videos here. Once you, listen, let me just say this a couple times. Once you get and understand the evidence for design, I don't know how it is not overwhelming to you. Once you know it, maybe you know it and have just backed off of it, or maybe you don't really know how much is necessary for us to live on planet Earth, and that's our point here. Our idea, the theistic idea, is that function appears designed because it is designed. The whole idea of function means that it accomplishes a purpose. There's a purpose for that. Well, that's the whole idea of teleological argument. The word telos means function or purpose mostly. That would be a good way to say it. Whatever caused the universe has to be immaterial because the universe is all matter. It has to be timeless. The cause of the universe has to be timeless because time came into existence when the universe, and it has to be uncaused. So you have an eternal first cause here. If that cause is eternal, why isn't because of the cause and effect? If let's look at it like this. If water had been a temperature at 212 degrees Fahrenheit for eternity, then water would have been boiling for eternity because the cause and effect go together. Once the necessary causes are there, then the effect is automatic. So why is that we have an eternal first cause, which is necessary, and yet a finite effect, the universe? And the reason for that, the only possible reason for that is that the eternal first cause has to be a mind, which has the potential to create at any point in the first point in time, but it's not necessary that first cause is also an eternal effect. And there's really no other argument that I could have. I've never had an argument that, and of course that's why they try to make nothing become something in some of the rejoinders from an eternal first cause. Then they want to say the universe came from nothing, but nothing means something more than nothing. We want to call this an initiation cause, that the eternal first cause, which we believe is God, because it is an intelligent cause. It has to instigate. It has to initiate. So it has a will. All I'm going to say is the eternal first cause of the universe, it's obvious, has a will and a great omnipotence and omniscience. Great power to bring the universe into existence, omniscience to make it work like it works. That's all introduction. The point, I'm going to read this to you, the point of the fine-tuning argument is, notice I use that word there, fine-tuning, and let me just say this. The scientific evidence for intelligent design in the last 50 years has been so overwhelming. Now, scientists won't say intelligent design. That sounds more like religion in their view. Well, I think it's just as scientific as it is religious. But the point is this, they don't use that word here, but here are the words they use, fine-tuning. You'll have lots of atheistic scientists talk about the fine-tuning of the universe, and what are they finally tuned for? Life on planet Earth. Well, here's another one, anthropic principle. Anthropic, of course, principle of life, anthropos, living beings. And so they use that all the time. Anthropic principle. What does that mean? It means all of the things necessary for life to exist on this planet in this universe. And so they use fine-tuning and anthropic principle, and they won't use intelligent design. It's the same thing. If something is a principle of life, it's all those things have to be brought together on purpose for life to exist, and that's exactly what's happened. I'm going to read you Romans 1, starting in verse 18, and bear with me if you're not a Bible believer and you think I'm a Bible thumper. Well, I probably am. Just listen to what the Bible's saying here about these things. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. I don't want to believe in God, so I'll come up with any scenario possible, any idea possible. If it's evolution, if it's multiple universes or infinite number of universes, now it's panpsychism. The universe is actually conscious. After saying for all those years from the atheists, there is no such thing as consciousness, now everything's conscious. Okay. Now here's what it says in verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. So what we're saying, and I would agree 100% with this, of course, that God really has provided evidence for his existence. He has shown it to us. Now, verse 20, and here's the key word, I think, or phrase, for his invisible attributes. Well, what does that mean? His invisible attributes, the nature of God. Obviously, God is invisible. He's not a physical being except in the person of Christ. Namely, and what are his invisible attributes? There are two things here. Number one, it says his eternal power. Well, if the universe came into existence from nothing, and it had a beginning, and we've already gone through this, then the first cause, there has to be an eternal, uncaused first cause, and that first cause has to be immaterial, timeless, so forth, uncaused, and with awesome power. Think about it. Creation means bringing something into existence from nothing. It's not quark theory. It's not quantum theory that may be involved in it in part of God's nature and part of God's plan and creation, but to create everything from nothing, and we're going to look at some verses that tell us how to do that, basically through his word, through his spoken word. So that's one of his invisible attributes, is omnipotence, his eternal power. And it's absolutely reasonable that that's the case. And then he says, namely his eternal power and divine nature. Now we're down to the moral argument. And the moral argument is that there is such a thing as morality. His divine nature is that there is a transcendent, that means outside of us, that is imposed upon us through our conscience, of course. Let me say it like this, and I don't want to stay here a long time because I want to give you some evidence for intelligent design, but I have to pause here and talk about this. If there is no God, and we are here by random chance, just by accident, and we just happen to either get lucky or unlucky, depending on how your life goes, I guess, then there is no should to our existence. If we're just here, it's just a brute fact. We're here by nothing, from nothing, for no reason. And so for us to start using you should do this and you should do that is meaningless. That's nihilism, by the way, which is the logical the logical goal of atheism. So if there is no such thing as should, then there is no such thing as morality. And if there is no such thing as morality, there is no such thing as should. You can't really say you should do this, you shouldn't do that. Even David Hume, the great skeptic, said you cannot get an ought from an is. In other words, this is the way things are, so here's what we should do. Now, of course, that's what secular humanism says, because, well, here we are. We're here by accident, but here we are. We better make the most of it. Here's what we should do. We should love one another. And then they start almost quoting the Bible. But there is no should, especially if we're just dancing to our DNA. And I had to make that point here. Nature itself doesn't have a moral aspect. When a lion kills its prey, it's not murder, it's nature. When we, on the other hand, if a person kills another person, a human being, if you justify that, then you have to have some kind of a just war or capital punishment, being a just punishment of some kind, or it's murder. Huge difference there. So, did you know in the last 50 years, science has discovered so much design, and that's why I said earlier, we call it the fine-tuning of the universe for life on planet Earth. We call it the anthropic principle, the overwhelming conditions for life. And I'll say this in the next video, but I'll finish with this. Carl Sagan in the 1960s was a very prominent astronomer, a brilliant guy, and very much an atheist. He did a series called the Nova series, in which he began every time with the universe is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be, which is a theological statement, of course. But here's what he said. I guess I could back up with Darwin, but we'll do that next time. But he said there's only two parameters necessary for life on Earth. That is, you have to have the planet that we have, and you have to have the proper size and distance of the sun. And that's what he said. So if that's the case, then there must be millions or trillions or billions of planets out there just like ours that have intelligent life. And so thus began in the early 1980s the organization called SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and they beamed signals. SETI lasted until 2021, but they never got a single response. And it appears now that we are very unique as a planet. I think we're even more unique than you think, maybe. But why does Earth, here's the question, we'll finish. Why does planet Earth thrive with life and planet Mars have none? We'll talk in the next time. Hope you're watching. Thanks.